As I was heading into my last semester of seminary, I was more excited about school than I had been in a long time. Now, you might find this surprising, but it wasn't just because the end was in sight. Despite the fact that I was about to finish 22nd grade, which I think absolutely entitles a person to a little bit of senioritis, I was very excited for my last semester because I was going to be taking a class that was called God, Suffering, and Evil. I know, sounds like a blast, right? As you probably could guess from the title, it was going to be all about how and why suffering and evil exist and where God fits into it all, a topic that has always fascinated me. And this class lived up to my expectations. It was everything that I had imagined a seminary class would be. And I only had to wait until my last semester to get it. It was small, there were maybe 10 of us, and we would sit around one large table with the professor. In every class, you had to read the assigned readings, which was usually an entire book, and come to class prepared to discuss the ideas that had been presented. We would analyze and pick apart and question these different explanations for why evil existed, different understandings for why suffering was something that we experience. Sadly, we didn't solve any of these age-old questions. I know. What were we doing? We had a whole semester to work on it. But we did sort through some really interesting ways of understanding and explaining the problem, and found some that were very helpful, and others that were, none of the words I want to use are appropriate, so I'll just say less than helpful. One of the theories that we discussed closely lines up with the passage that we just heard from Paul's letter to the Romans. Starting in verse 3, he says, "And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope." This is a pretty common way of coming at the problem. Rather than try to understand or explain the source, the cause of the suffering, it looks at the result. It essentially takes suffering as a given and looks at how we should view our experience of that suffering. I'm sure that most of you have experienced what Paul is talking about at some point. You go through a difficult period, experience something tragic, and in the moment, it feels like there's nothing redeemable about it, no greater purpose to it. But when it has passed, as most times like that do, you look back and you see the ways that you grew because of it. You see the lessons that you learned, the ways that you are now stronger as a result of having endured and having persevered and made it through to the other side. I saw a bumper sticker that said, "Oh no, not another character building experience." But all jokes aside, this is a pretty healthy way of looking at the problem. Sometimes things are outside of our control. And the only thing that we can control is how we respond to them, how we approach them, the mindset that we have while we're experiencing them. And if we view an experience as something that is just awful and horrible and think absolutely nothing good could possibly come from it, well, that is exactly what will happen. But if we acknowledge the pain, if we admit, yes, this is awful and I hate it and I wish it wasn't so, nevertheless, I will get through this, and I will be stronger as a result. When we do that, we find that there can be positive outcomes to these crucible moments, that when we are pressed under the weight of great adversity, we grow, becoming wiser and stronger as a result. No one masters a new subject matter without hours of studying. You don't get the perfect beach bod without a few hours of breaking a sweat. I know, because I've been trying the couch potato approach for years, and it has yet to pay off. If suffering is going to happen anyway, we may as well treat it as something that will ultimately be productive, right? Look for the silver lining and focus on the end result. This is absolutely true, to a certain degree, because there are also some inherent flaws. Do the ends justify the means? If we grew as a result of an event, does that mean that that event was good? It works with some things like working out and studying, but not as much with more radical forms of suffering, like the Holocaust or sexual and domestic violence. And we run the risk of using the mindset in ways that are irresponsible and harmful, rather than using it as a response to suffering that is inevitable. We use it to justify suffering that we just don't really want to work to get rid of, suffering that benefits some by keeping others down. For centuries, this line of reasoning was used in the systematic oppression of women. Yes, we know that you are suffering, but that suffering will produce character. You should follow the example of Jesus, who suffered in silence on the cross, and someday that patience and endurance will be rewarded. Slave owners, colonizers, those in positions of power who convinced the oppressed and the downtrodden in their society that the suffering they were experiencing here on earth should simply be endured because they would be rewarded in the next life. In fact, it was a privilege to suffer, for theirs would be the kingdom of heaven. We are seeing the results of this narrative, this practice of ignoring, or worse, justifying suffering that does not need to happen. Suffering that could be prevented if we all were to work together, if we treated each person as the beloved child of God that they are and valued their lives even above our own. We are seeing the results of that tactic. We are hearing the cries of people who for too long have been silenced. We are seeing the passion and anger and frustration of people who for too long have lived in fear. People of color around the world are speaking out against the suffering that they have experienced at the hands of unjust systems, speaking out against the pain that has been explained away or worse, flat out ignored, speaking out against the ways that their communities have unfairly borne the cost of so many things, the coronavirus pandemic being just the latest in a long list. And let us not forget that this is also Pride Month, the month when we celebrate the LGBTQ community, celebrate the progress that has been made while taking a sobering look at the work that still remains. We recognize and honor the sacrifices and struggles that were endured to make those steps forward possible, suffering that did indeed produce endurance and character, but suffering that was preventable. You can see now why our class didn't come up with very many answers, because an explanation that seems to work perfectly in some situations falls apart and can even become harmful in others. But whenever Paul speaks of suffering, it is always done so in conjunction with hope. Now, usually when you hear that word hope, it sounds something like, oh, I hope the traffic isn't too bad, or I hope this meeting doesn't take too long. It's basically just, wishful thinking. But hope in the Christian sense of the word is different. It conveys certainty, confidence, assurance. It is something that is firm and trustworthy. It's less wishful and more knowing because it is based upon the promises of God. There's a grammatical structure in the Old Testament called the prophetic perfect tense. I've talked about it before, so you may remember it. But essentially it says that you can talk about things that God has promised to do in the past tense. Because if God promised to do them, then the certainty that they will happen is so great that you can talk about them like they already have. If God promised to do it, then it's like it's already been done. Theologian Daniel Schroer described the Bible in part as a story about this group of people seeking to figure out who this God is and whether or not God is trustworthy. And in the end, we come to the conclusion that yes, in fact, God is trustworthy. We look at the promise that was made to all of humanity that God will never again send a flood to consume the whole world, marked by the hanging of God's war bow, a rainbow in the sky. We look at the promises made to Abraham that his descendants would number as many as the stars in the night sky. We look at the promises that God made to the people of Israel, how they were led up out of Egypt, how their story always arced from slavery and captivity, whether it be in mind, body, or spirit, that it always arced towards freedom and liberation. Some promises, as Pastor Laura mentioned last week, have yet to be fully fulfilled, like the ones that we remember in Mary's Magnificat that we sing during Holden evening prayer. That the lowly will be lifted up, the mighty cast down from their thrones, the weak and lowly favored, and the proud of heart humbled. These things have yet to fully come to pass. And yet, Mary speaks about them in the past tense. Knowing, trusting, having hope in the work of God. I was watching the movie Under the Tuscan Sun a few weeks ago, and in it, one of the characters tells a story. Now, I searched high and low on the internet to find out if this story is true or not and couldn't find anything. But the sentiment of the story is true, so that's good enough for me. There's this section of the Alps between Austria and Italy that is full of notoriously steep and treacherous mountain slopes. And they built a train track over them to connect Vienna and Venice. But they built the tracks before there was a train in existence that was powerful enough to climb such a steep grade and make the journey. They built the tracks because they knew that the train would come. That's what Christian hope is. Ultimately, our greatest source of assurance, our best reason for having this sure and certain kind of hope is because of what God did in the person of Jesus. It was through Jesus that God fulfilled the promise to always be with us. In Jesus, God became human and experienced all that humanity entails so that we might know that we are not alone as we walk through this life. God suffered and died on the cross so that we might know that we are not alone when we experience suffering and hardship. And God caused Jesus to rise from the dead on the third day, that empty tomb, a beacon of hope. A beacon of assurance that death and suffering will never have the final word, that God is already in the process of making all things new, that God is about redemptive transformation. We are being called to participate in that process of redemptive transformation right now by acknowledging the suffering that exists in the world, some that is unavoidable and some that need not be. Each and every one of us has been marked by the reality of suffering. Each of us has experienced hardships, trials and tribulations, times that test our grit and fortitude, our character and endurance. We are collectively in the midst of such a time right now. Into the pain and grief and suffering of this worldwide pandemic, we must speak words of grace and comfort and kindness to one another. We must find ways to connect and reach out and help one another shoulder the weight of it all. We must also acknowledge forms of suffering that we do not fully understand because we have not personally experienced them. We must listen with open minds and hearts to the lived experiences of others. We must look inwards, search ourselves for the ways that we have been complicit and allowed that suffering to continue unnecessarily. And we must find ways to bring about real, tangible change. That is how we will begin to engage in God's work of redemptive transformation. I don't know exactly what that will look like. I think it will vary for each of us. But what I do know is that it all begins with hope. Hope that is built upon the foundation of God's trustworthy and steadfast nature. Hope that looks with certainty towards the future. Hope that knows that the story is not yet finished. Hope that lifts our eyes to the horizon towards a future that is not yet but shall be. Hope that does not disappoint. Amen.